what I wanted to ask you specifically is you went through and you learned a lot of those jobs, but as a researcher, how do you come in as PD? Because one of your responsibilities is to air check the talent, and you already had an all-star. Talk about, I mean, wasn't JJ in the morning crew? Who else was on the air at the Riff that you were responsible for at that time?
So we kind of ended up adopting the Channel 7 philosophy of we got who you wanted. When they put together their superhero lineup of Bill Bonds and John Kelly and Marilyn Turner and Dave Dials and Jerry Hodak, I mean, ultimately that's what we ended up doing at Riff. And during Bender's time there, that's in a fairly short period of time. Arthur, of course, was there and was a fixture. By that point, he'd already been on the radio station for 15 years, which seemed like eons, right? But then JJ and the Morning Crew came over from W4. Ken Calvert, who had been with ABX in the early years, was a record guy for CBS Records, and he became the midday person. Karen Savelli came over, I believe, from W4, but it may have been ABX at that point. I can't remember even where we brought her in from, but she came in at nights. I believe I brought Costan in at a later point. We already had Carl Coffey.
Wow, yeah. Carl Coffey, who was doing nights, who could have been morning man anywhere else.
Exactly right. I mean, it was such a super staff. I got to hire Peter Werby, who was an institution in the market in the early years. And Peter was a part-timer. I mean, back in those days, if you were a part-timer at Riff, you were in the union, and it was a very lucrative gig. I mean, it paid extremely well. You were on a great set of call letters. And, you know, when Arthur would take one of his many weeks off, you very likely got to sit in for him in afternoon drive. So being a part-timer at Riff was an incredibly great gig, not like it is today, where if you're a part-timer at a radio station, you're probably driving an Uber and working for DoorDash at the same time. Back then, I mean, you could really make a living, and a nice living, being a part-time jock for ABC. It was pretty cool.
And competitive. Could you talk about the dynamic as a program director? Your job lives and dies with how you're doing against the competition. In Detroit at the time, I mean, it's still a rock and roll city, but you mentioned it earlier. You had all these rock and roll stations, all distinctively different, but all trying to get the same market, the same audience. What was that? That had to be a crazy time in radio for you.
It was really intense. I mean, as a program director, and those people who you talk to who worked with me back then, or unfortunately worked for me back then, can tell you all about that. I mean, I was high energy, caffeinated, stressed out, pretty much 24/7. I mean, we gotta beat wheels. We gotta beat wheels. We gotta beat wheels. Well, exactly. And I mean, I have an incredibly strong work ethic. I always have. And B, to be honest with you, when you take over programming your favorite radio station in your hometown, I mean, all you can think about is don't screw it up. I mean, don't blow this thing. I mean, this is an unbelievably golden opportunity here to take over Riff. It frankly would have been a lot easier taking over MMS in Cleveland or KLOS in Los Angeles, because even though I knew those were great radio stations, I didn't grow up with them. I didn't grow up in Cleveland or LA. I mean, you only have partial knowledge when you move somewhere and you take over a programming job. You don't have that emotional bond with a market or a station. But with Riff, I had that. And so there was that constant pressure of, you know, do good things, make the radio station better than when you came. And again, competitively, I mean, we had great competitors across the dial, and it was intense. And the other thing that happened around that same period was the ratings went from quarterly to monthly. So you can kind of do the math. Instead of throwing up 4 times a year for a couple of days before the numbers would come out, you would be nauseous and worthless 12 times a year, dealing with monthly ratings. And the monthlies, especially in the early years, bounced around a little bit more. They didn't really have that stability that they kind of had later. Now they're just as bad, but that's another story. But back then they really could bounce around, and nobody really knew how to deal with them because it was just like a new currency. So
Right.
everybody probably took them a little more serious than we should have, but I mean, they were the numbers, and you live and die with the book. I mean, that's where your rates get set. That's what, pays for the RIF building and pays for all those hefty salaries and all that stuff. I mean, you got to keep your numbers up and dominant. So there was a ton of pressure. And I mean, believe it or not, I mean, yeah, I've been involved with RIF now for decades. I still continue to consult them today. Thank you, Caroline Beasley and the Detroit team. But, I actually only programmed there for 2 years, from 81 to 83. And honestly, Ron, that was enough. I mean, I learned that being on the front lines of a major market radio station, it's like combat pay for me. And honestly, I had, not to take anything away from the veterans who have given so much to our country, but I had my own form of PTSD. And I needed to get away from it, and it was probably unhealthy for me. And I waited for a great book and walked.